ain't no education occurring systemically in public school districts throughout the United States. Therefore, it's understandable that charter schools emerged. But overall, ain't much education occurring in charter schools either. So, hey, we up against the wall. Parents and citizens of students in the schools, because, hey, unless parents and citizens become enlightened and vigilant and make the public schools and the charter schools educate our children, then the less said the better in terms of our future going down the sewer. So what I'm stressing as I leave this microphone, given I only had 2 minutes, is that since all of us in here are citizens, whether we, in terms of most of our children are grown and long gone from the schools, but we as citizens and the parents, hey, either we get on the case and start taking care of business and becoming enlightened and vigilant and involving ourselves and bringing and making education occur in our schools, or it ain't gonna happen. And then one thing I want to say in terms of Cleveland, that means start attending Cleveland Board of Education meetings, where at this juncture, only my soulmate and I and about a handful of other people speak at the meetings month to month, except for people coming down when something's happening to their child. So again, we got to get on the case.
Next is Devin Branch with Safety and Policing.
Okay, so we had questions that were given, the group, and we only got to one of the questions and it sparked the conversation. And that question was, what surprised you most about the panelists' remarks? But we took it a different direction and we said, what did we find most striking? And what one of our group members said was, I found it most striking that if everything was going so good in Glenville, why did they have an uprising? Why was there a revolt? And so the conclusion we came to was the fact that it was produced by the pressure of oppression and the reality of the colonial relationship between the people in that community and the police force that controlled it. And that also brought forth another question, which is, of all the talk, people talked about the grocery store and the ice cream shop. There were over a dozen police shot that day. Nobody said, oh shucks, isn't it so bad what happened to the police? Nobody said it. And nobody that we spoke to in the group we asked, have you heard anybody else complain about that reality either? And they said, no, never heard about that either. No one, and we linked that to the reality of a recognition of that colonial relationship, that people knew that was an enemy force. They were soldiers fighting the enemy force, and they were legitimate in doing so. Now, the other thing we discussed was, okay, well, what does good policing actually look like? We were wrapping up at 5 minutes. And that was something, what was spoken of was something that looks more like suburban policing, effectively, which is more decentralized and where you do have a situation where there's a greater relationship, in some cases more residency of the people in the community, but that addresses an issue that we have now, and that is that it is now illegal. What was the law is now illegal. It was the law that if you worked for the city, you lived in the city. That law is now illegal. So now you cannot impose that. You can't impose residency requirements, which means that you cannot impose that the people who police your community live in your community or reflect the demographics of that community, and that contributes to the perpetuation of that colonial relationship and that hostility, which will remain there as long as the police force are an imposition on the community and not a product of the community's needs for safety. So that was mostly it. Thank you.
Kim Foreman will discuss housing.
So it was decided that housing was not a sexy topic, but I think we had a lot of things come forth in our conversation. Some of the big topics related to why people even came in the circle is gentrification. Some folks were property owners, affordability, the foreclosure crisis and the value of housing, redlining, housing availability and access, and at the end of the day, the root cause of some of these issues was systems and structural racism, tying everything together. It's just a component of that. And so we started to have a conversation around the migration in the 50s, and the only housing available, decent housing, was in Glenville, and that there was some areas after the uprising that were separated, which led to no insurance, no loans, for homeowners, banks. They depended on Cleveland Trust and the savings and loans, Superior Savings Loan. Cleveland Trust took all their money. And the savings and loans mortgage company was a place of dependency, as well as the credit unions and the churches that came in as a solution to this banking crisis. So a lot of our discussion was grounded in redlining, the banking and insurance. Even to this day, that also was a result of what happened in '68. And so we also talked about the overcrowding issue, because the question was what led to this uprising in relation to housing. And it was said that Huff had it a lot worse, but the still conditions existed where landlords would carve up small spaces and overcrowd families in housing, and it didn't really contribute per se, but it was a condition in the community. But the rent, higher rents. We also talked about, on the other side of it, one family was able to afford their home by having these spaces for renters to come in, but it wasn't necessarily an overcrowding issue, but it was an issue of economics for them. And so we also got into a conversation about today's current events that lead to root shock, which is a new term for me. It's a form of PTSD when people are uprooted from their homes, and what this causes and the trauma that it causes for folks. Also, one of our folks in our circle was new to Cleveland, but noticed that it's the same story, just in different locations across the nation. So this is not unique. This story around housing and gentrification and displacement is going on across the country. And one thing that was brought up is that the counseling issue around counseling available for families, well, at that time, they only dealt with extreme cases. There was no funding or no centers for counseling, so to speak, and that's at that time. It was really just dealing with extreme cases around issues for families to deal with the situations. So that was pretty much all we had to say. Anybody want to add to that? That was in my group. Housing is sexy to me because it is really imperative to safety of our families and mental health. And so I work on lead and environmental health issues, and that was not brought up in our session, but it's a huge topic across the country that we've been dealing with for decades, and it intersects and connects to all of these other issues that we've been talking about today. So at some point, maybe tomorrow, we'll talk more about that. But because of who was in our circle and the generation that was in our circle, we talked more about that, the loans and the redlining.
Alex Harris will present public health.
How y'all doing? We talked about public health, and the first question that popped up was basically how was Glenville, what was happening prior to Glenville's public health after the riots. And the main thing we talked about was, and there was a lot of wisdom that came to our table. Thank you, young lady. But basically what was going on, basically we talked about black doctors, and it was a lot of black doctors who are in the communities, and it's like they dwindled off. It's like basically we start going to like clinics, and it was different clinics, and we also talked about doctors coming to your home because you had a lot of people in the household. You had people working 2 jobs and had 6 children, so they had doctors that came in and was able to help. We also talked about mental health. And when we talked about mental health, we talked about a lot of things that were going on with people after this situation happened. People not knowing who they are, and them dealing with these different type of issues. Basically, they never got their time to deal with what was going on in their household, what was going on with them. They just moved on and carried it along like nothing happened. That was something that was implemented. We also had someone talking about parents and parenting and the different objects of what was going on as far as like carrying a baby and the different epidemics between white and blacks with carrying a baby and the trauma that they deal with in their household, especially carrying on with their kids, where they end up having kids prematurely and dealing with the issues that they have. That was the main thing that we talked about, was really mental health. The one thing I'm just going to leave with this, because we didn't talk too much, it was really deeply about mental health and how we handle ourselves as people and us knowing who we are. Y'all talked a lot about people moving out of the communities. The thing that touched my spirit and that I really want y'all to take home with you is, are you willing to suffer? When you have a plan and when we come together like this and when we're dealing with something that's trying to push the culture forward, pushing our people forward, pushing a better purpose forward, are you willing to suffer? It's highs and lows that's gonna come with this, but are you willing to suffer to carry out the plan that we have, or the plan that God has for you? We are all here to uplift each other, to love each other, to really carry on. Y'all talked about Martin Luther King and how he had a plan, and when he got killed, that whole plan was taken apart. Were you willing to suffer and carry on what was laid, the groundwork that was laid down to you? That's it.
Eric Johnson will present economic development and employment with Alexis.
I'm not confused by myself.
You should. You're fine.
Hey, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The conversation we were dealing with was economic development and employment. And I had a couple of things I want to highlight, and I had a couple of things I wanted Alexis to touch on, because she has some real strong opinions, and as you can tell, there's a little bit of a generational difference. But one of the things that we did ask the questions that were on the sheet, and the surprise that came about was, what that was defined, was that there were no defining terms for what some of the issues were. So we really need to define what some of our ailments are. And when it came down to defining economic development, we found our group had a broad number of perspectives about what that actually was. So we had to work on dealing with that process. And the other question was, what would be a part of the redevelopment that's going to take place in Glenville? It's happening right now. As a number of people in our group attested to, that there's redevelopment going on right now in Glenville that we aren't a part of. So what's going to happen? How are we going to be involved in that process? And the other thing I wanted to touch on was a critical point that was brought up by someone, was that we have different levels of currency that we're not using. We have the currency of the vote. We have the currency of the dollar. We have the currency of time. And we have the currency of talent. And we are not making the most effective use of those processes and resources in our community. So if we're going to move forward, we're going to need that. And then you want to touch on?
So what we define as a group as economic development is a means of obtaining currency or funds, production of value, so production of something of value so that consumers will consume it, being a consumer, and that is territorial. So it's really going to be focused on a specific geographic area, be that a neighborhood, a city, a state, or a region or a state. but we've focused a lot of our time, most of our time really on Glenville. And Eric said I had really strong opinions because I ended up as the only millennial in the group. And as you may guess, there are some generational differences in how we view economic development and economic needs. And one of the things that I said was, you can't expect someone to buy a home when they already financed a home with their student loans. I mean, it's strapped on their back. You're never going to get rid of it, maybe with death, but you're going to have to deal with that issue because we're buying homes later than our grandparents did, than our great-grandparents did, than our parents did, because we don't have the financial freedom and we have debt. We come out of school 22, 23, maybe with debt, and then we keep on going to school, a lot of us, some of us. So we're gonna have debt, and we're gonna have to deal with the fact that we already paid for a house. So we can't buy, one of those really luxurious renovated homes in Glenville or on Shaker Boulevard or wherever in the city, even if we wanted to. Or we're gonna have to be really creative about the ways that we do that, and I don't think that there's a clear pathway always about that creativity. And I think some of that is the same about, starting our own businesses, being entrepreneurs. There's a lot of fear of obtaining more debt on top of the debt that we have. Because we already know that's something that's not going away.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there are two things I want to do before I bring back Dr. Ray Wimbush to close us out. With all of the alumni, staff, community partners connected to this work in Glenville, please stand. So Alex, you need to stand. Mama Freeman, you need to stand. All the alumni, all the people that are connected to this work, connected to community, connected to people. Sherry, you've been a long-time community partner. So thank you, Mother Southgate. So these folks are the reason that we were able to do this. And I want to, again, shout out the folks over in the Soul Bazaar on the side. A lot of our community partners have information over there, and we were talking about maintaining our culture through music and the arts. We have a young artist over here, Jaquez Payne Brown, who is a Hawken alum, one of my buddies. This is one of my little brothers, and a Grambling grad, which is why he has on that shirt. All the people here who went to HBCUs, all right. Because he is kind of popular around the city, he has run out of cards, but make sure that you go and take a look at his work. And I've definitely been making sure this is an empowerment piece. And so when I meet young people that are doing amazing work, I tell them in advance, I'm gonna throw you out there. I've been throwing him out there, he can tell you, since we were at Hawken Homecoming last year. So I'm gonna continue to make sure that he's visible. Last thing is, Don Freeman has one more announcement that I'm gonna allow him to make, and then Devin. The 23rd. I know, but still, remind people if they're not coming tomorrow. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, essentially two, really. I still have copies of my book, Reflections of a Resolute Radical, if anybody wants to get one before they leave, and get their $25 a copy. Now, what I want to stress is that WKYC Channel 3 has interviewed me, and in terms of the interview, it's in regard to the Glenville shootout, plus my involvements in the 1960s. This interview will be televised on Channel 3, WKYC, at 11 p.m. on this coming next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. This coming Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, WKYC, Channel 3, 11 p.m. news. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And we know there are a few people that may not be able to join us for both days, so I wanted Devin to make sure that he announced the Commemoration Vigil.
I was hoping there would still be flyers, but there are no flyers. But on July 23rd at 6 p.m., there will be a commemoration at Lakeview in Auburndale, which happens every year. It's a commemoration of the shootout. And there'll be people speaking about and it's in your booklet. Something about it is in your booklet. Shamaria, in fact, could you come up, Shamaria, with the flyer so we can show people the flyer? And then there's something about it in your booklet. So we're going to meet around 5 o'clock at the African American Museum and drive a convoy up Superior to Lakeview and Auburndale like we do every year. And the commemoration usually takes a little bit over an hour, depending on how verbose the speakers are. So this is the flyer. These are some of the brothers who were involved in the shootout. Ahmed, of course, what we call Lil Ahmed, who I didn't call Little Ahmed for obvious reasons. Nandu, who did 26 years in prison for the shootout, and Asu, and with the exception of Ahmed Evans and Nandu, who was 19, his twin brother was killed that day. The others were tried as juveniles and only did a few years in prison for, I think, 7 counts of first-degree murder. That's what they were charged with. And so I think it's important to come, and so if you have the time and you can show up, show up. Thank you.
Last thing from me, if you are coming to join us for day 2 tomorrow, make sure that you bring your program booklets. We were excited to see all of these people. There were more than 100 people in attendance here, but because of that, we are really short on programs. So make sure that you bring your program with you tomorrow so that you can follow along. Dr. Wimbush. Bless you.
Bless. You can always tell the success of a conference by how many people are at the end of the conference because they wanted to stay. So it's good to see a lot of you still here. I learned a lot today, and I hope, and I was really happy during the group, people were coming to me saying things like, I didn't know that happened. This is new to me. And some of these are people in Cleveland. So I won't be here tomorrow. I wish I was. I've got to drive to Montgomery, Alabama to be a part of the new Peace and Freedom exhibit that commemorated the lynching of our ancestors. So I'm looking forward to that, but good luck. Invite me back to Cleveland. Don't let it be another 25 years, okay? All right.